to Pals in Politics, the place to hear from those teaching, learning, and impacted by politics, government, citizenship, and democracy.
Hello there, and welcome to our latest Pals and Politics podcast, where we talk frankly and openly with our wonderful guests about their insights and their views on how politics is shaping their lives, their work, their careers, or even their studies. So whether you are here as a student, a teacher, or just someone who is interested in the political world, you've come to the right place to hear from a variety of people who are living and breathing it. If you want to hear more of our conversation today, you can do so in our politics classroom, the link of which is in the comments. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button as well. Today, I'm extremely fortunate to be joined by George Vlachonikolis. Hi, George.
Hiya.
Nice to see you. Thank you very much for giving up your, what is now evening, to do this.
Yeah, no problem.
So George is one of the assistant head teachers at Headington Rye School Oxford, and he has a background in economics and international politics, and he is also a teacher of economics and also the chair of examiners for one of England's main exam boards. So a lot there, George.
Yeah, nice to be with you again, James. I don't know if the people know, but obviously we used to work together. And we used to share an office together.
We did. Feels like a long time ago now.
It was a long time ago now, I think.
It was actually, it came up as a Facebook memory. It was 5 years ago today that I left.
Oh, but it was 9 years ago that I joined Headington. So there you go. We overlapped for 4 years.
I know. And we're both still alive to tell the tale. So that's always a good sign. So I can personally vouch for everyone that George is going to be extremely interesting because, as I said, we shared an office for years and we never ran out of things to debate and discuss, did we, George?
That's true.
So let's tap into your experience. And I'm really excited because I think you always did in our discussions, you really sit at the intersection of politics and economics. And I know you've taught both and you've studied both. So I'm really interested to hear actually about how you view the world at the moment through that intersection of politics and economics. And I suppose my first big question to you, and it is a big question, do you think we're moving into an era where soft economic power or economic power is replacing hard political power?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Maybe I'll try and come on to that. Let me just dial it a little bit back to the intersection of economics and politics. One of my big mantras in my classroom is I do think the subjects are best studied together. And actually, the conclusion that we reach in our classroom a lot of the time is, even though something makes perfectly good economic sense, the economic theory and the analysis suggests that policy A is going to be a good choice. Actually, what you find is that's rarely the political decision. And therefore, if you do study them together, I think, again, one of the conclusions you reach is that politics probably sits above economics in terms of it doesn't really matter if it makes good economic sense or not. It hinges on whether it makes good political sense or not. So then let's come back to your question, really.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Before you do, can I interject there? Because actually, I'm just thinking what came to my mind when you said that was the proposed welfare cuts that Rachel Reeves and the government tried to introduce last summer, where there was an economic argument that was made, but actually was rowed back. And what was essentially a 30-page bill suddenly became a 2-page bill in the face of political opposition. Is that what you're talking about?
All right, if we take that as an example, I think for me, the main economic aim of that particular policy was to try and get more people into work. We've got 9 million people who are economically inactive. And although some of those are students at school and university, it doesn't account for the majority. So this was a proposal to try and get more people into work. And for me, that makes very, very good economic sense. But you're right, it didn't get through. Now, why didn't it get through? It didn't get through because of political ideology, because of manifesto pledges, because of that's not the way that the Labour backbenchers wanted their government to move. So ultimately, politics trumps economics. So we can have the advantages, disadvantages debate in class, in economics class, for any such policy. But again, one of the conclusions I'll always reach with the students is, but does it make political sense? Because if it doesn't make political sense, then it doesn't get through.
Yeah, so I suppose, sorry, I interrupted you there. Does that then say that the argument that we're moving into an era of soft economic influence mattering more than hard power, is that not the case, do you think?
Okay, if you were in my classroom proposing that, I'd ask you to go back and define soft economic power. But if I try and define economic power as money, nah, I'm afraid I see that as hard power. I think money talks. It particularly talks in an age of very concentrated wealth. And you're seeing that. I mean, it used to be that we had the oligarchs in Russia where the concentrated wealth was. Well, now you're seeing that in the USA particularly. You're seeing that in the UK as well. I think there's a lot of concentrated wealth and therefore quite a lot of concentrated economic power. And it's been interesting watching the back and forth with Donald Trump and the tech bros, who has the upper hand there. But you know as well as me that a lot of these political campaigns, particularly in the States, are absolutely dependent on the amount of money coming into the super PACs and funding. That no, I don't see it as soft economic power. I see it as hard economic power.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And when I used to teach American politics, one of the Supreme Court cases I always used to really spend probably a disproportionate amount of time on, Citizens United. And that ruling that essentially corporations were individuals and therefore had that constitutional right to free speech, thus by definition the right to donate. Yeah, so I think that's a really, really good point. When you look at, for example, the news at the moment, and when we're recording this, it's obviously in the middle of the Middle East conflict, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. You've obviously got overwhelming American and Israeli military power, and you've got Iran, who's essentially managed to shut or severely damage the world's economy with a few submarine drones and close the Strait of Hormuz. What do you think that tells us about the relationship between economics and sort of power and hard power?
Well, economics is being used as a weapon in that sense. And again, it's really interesting in this period of time to, particularly with the presidency of Donald Trump, everything that he's trying to do, everything that his kind of whole political leverage seems to hang on these economic financial deals. And if you're prepared to work with me, then I'll do you a good deal. But if you're not prepared to work with me, then I'm going to put 50% tariffs on. And then tomorrow it'll be 90%. And the day after it'll be 100%. And in fact, you'll know better than me, but wasn't his comeback to Spain or the Spanish prime minister recently, well, if you're not going to work with us in Iran, then that's it. That's the end of trade.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Supreme Court have kind of thrown a bit of the spanner into the works, quite unexpectedly, actually, throwing a bit of the spanner into those plans. But yes, I think there's no doubt he uses them as a weapon. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that, I mean, for me, that is interesting. Economics here is being used as a weapon. Iran have clearly planned for this. They knew exactly what they're doing. They're attacking. It's the oil price for us over here in the UK. But if you're Dubai or if you're Qatar or somewhere else, it's also having an enormous effect on your tourism industry and foreign direct investment industry as well. So yeah, this is a weapon.
Absolutely, and the historian in me would also point to other like the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where America only helped Israel so far because it feared the weaponization of oil. One of the main reasons I would argue President George W. Bush didn't go after Iran when it was first deemed to be building a nuclear weapon was it feared exactly these consequences. So I can't decide if Donald Trump is just doing what American presidents have arguably put off for decades, or is there a reason why they've been putting it off for decades and this is just mad? I can't decide, because I think most people would agree we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a particularly controversial viewpoint, at least in the West anyway. But they've got this disproportionate amount of power despite up against the world's largest military superpower through economics.
I guess with my, I guess then I would be looking through a military lens there, James, and thinking, well, you've got to exploit your force multipliers wherever you can get a competitive advantage against your enemy. That's where you'll apply pressure, and they've been planning for this. They've done their homework. They've studied the late 70s and the oil price shocks and inflationary pressures that were happening there, which, by the way, I still use, or at least I used to use, as my most recent example of hyperinflation. Well, because we didn't really have anything else to talk about in terms of hyperinflation in the UK until you go back to 1979. And now, like you've implied there, we're sort of seeing history repeating itself a little bit there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely, I believe it's called asymmetric warfare, where you can't defeat your enemy militarily. So you essentially attack their weak spot in whatever way you can. Okay, really interesting. And I'm sure, I don't want to say we'll see how it plays out. Hopefully it doesn't play out in a elongated way, but if it does, maybe we can revisit this conversation. So thank you, George. I'd like to move on to now your sort of role as a teacher. And you are, as we both said, at Headington, and a fantastic all-girls school in Oxford. And obviously you spend your time, as you've said, working with lots of young people. How do they feel, if you were to sort of characterize, and I appreciate it's a generalization, but how would you characterize their feelings about the world that they're heading into?
Yeah, all right. I'll come at this kind of obliquely, and then we'll see if I ended up answering your question or not. I get asked quite a lot about teaching at an all-girls school and what's the difference between teaching girls and boys, particularly in an economics environment, but also in a political one. And there is a lot of academic research out there. There's also a lot of kind of sexist mumbo jumbo out there, which argues that girls in general are not as motivated as boys by money, by the idea of high wages, working in finance, working in the city, working for one of the big corporate entities out there. And I always have to look at my own experience. 9 years working at Headington, it just simply hasn't been the case. I often find that the girls that I'm teaching are incredibly motivated by the idea of money and making lots of money working in the city. And if we're thinking about where on the spectrum they are, again, I think a lot of people in education just assume that we're perhaps left or left of center, whereas actually some of the girls, a lot of the girls that I'm teaching, bear in mind that I'm teaching 50% international students as well by the time that they're doing A-levels. A lot of the girls that I'm teaching are often the fiercest critics of things like the welfare state, the most proponent advocates, if that's a word, the most strong advocates of things like deregulation, market efficiencies, privatization. I mean, we've been doing that debate fairly recently about privatization of the NHS, potential renationalization of the railways. And, if we took it to a vote, I suspect the vote would generally be that markets and market efficiency tends to have better outcomes than big nanny state enterprises. So I'm not sure I answered your question, did I? You asked if they were positive or negative.
Well, I asked if they were optimistic.
I think they are optimistic in general. They're optimistic. I don't think they're that pessimistic about AI that people assume that they are, and they're worried about losing their jobs. If they have pessimism, I think their pessimism is rooted in the strange, or the, if we're talking about economics, a lot of the policies that have been coming out, I'm not trying to be political here, but a lot of the politics and the economic decisions that have been coming out, I would say recently, haven't made an enormous amount of economic sense. And so when we're trying to look at them objectively, I think some of my students are becoming frustrated by some of those policies.
Okay, that's a interesting way of looking at it. And I think I mean, I remember my time there just like you, and I would completely agree with you that all the girls I taught were incredibly motivated and interested in the world around them, politically, economically, culturally, and socially. I think as well.
Do you want me to give you an example? Let's take something
please.
like the minimum wage. I think most people would naturally assume that a group of young people would always be in favor of increasing the minimum wage. And if you ever talked about freezing the minimum wage or even decreasing the minimum wage, or if you look abroad at where, the United States, I think it's a federal minimum wage of about $7.50, which is 50% what it is here. I think there's an assumption that we'll all go, oh, that doesn't sound great. That doesn't sound very fair. And actually what we should be calling for is greater equality. Those are actually some of the most interesting classes that we have at school, because it's not quite as one way as you might imagine. There are definitely dissenting voices there. And I think if you talk about the implications of a higher minimum wage on costs, maybe at the cafe or in the local supermarket, well, I don't know. There's quite a few girls, there's quite a few students in general who might oppose that as an argument. Also, it affects them, by the way, getting jobs, getting local jobs.
Do you think being in an all-girls environment, and the answer might be no here, but do you think being in an all-girls environment offers any particular opportunities to studying or nurturing an interest in economics and politics?
I think the opportunities that arise are, there's a great quote that I've got from a former GSA, Girls Schools Association president, that says, the first question that gets asked in my classroom is from a girl. The last question that gets asked in my classroom is from a girl. And I think that matters more than you might think. There's an amazing piece of research out recently which has tracked the amount of interruptions that an economics lecturer or an economics presenter in a seminar will face. And it's statistically significant that if you're female presenter, that you'll get interrupted more. So I think it's clear that if you're in an all-girls school, if you're in an all-girls setting, your voice will be heard. Your voice, it's a much more open forum for you to have a voice, for you to challenge somebody else but it won't be judged. It won't be seen as intimidating, or you won't back down quite as easily. There is actually a forum here for debate.
That's fantastic. And hopefully, as we see Parliament, the House of Commons now at least being 41% female, a record high, we will see more and more girls coming out of school and actually going into the world of politics, not even just formal politics, but political and economic roles. And I think that's really important.
I would wonder if you could replicate a similar study and just look at the female members of Parliament and how likely they are to be interrupted during a Q&A session in the Houses of Parliament compared to their male counterparts. That would genuinely be an interesting piece of research, I think.
Well, and it's only anecdotal, it's not research, but Rachel Reeves has made numerous points that she feels that being the first woman chancellor has brought with it perhaps a different set of expectations. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, now you really are asking me to get political, James.
You don't have to answer if you don't want to.
I'm a 44-year-old white male. It's far far be it for me to tell Rachel Reeves what experience she's had of sexism, or, you know, dare I label it misogyny in the workplace. I wouldn't want to do that. All I can ever do in the classroom is present Rachel Reeves's policy ideas as neutrally as possible, and I will let my students wrestle with the idea of whether they are effective or not.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question before we take a short break, and it's very much a short response answer, please, George. Before the classroom, I'm right in thinking that you were in the armed forces. And I suppose I wanted to ask you, not to dwell on that experience, but just from that experience, what is the biggest takeaway that it taught you about the nature of politics?
About the nature of politics,
yeah,
rather than the nature of teaching.
The nature of politics.
I don't know if it taught me an awful lot, James. I don't think being in the military teaches you to be a politician. I think being in the military teaches you to work as a team, to genuinely be collaborative. And I was lucky enough to go through my training at the Royal Academy Sandhurst, which has the motto "Serve to Lead." And the Army's definition of leadership is in service to others. And when I look at politics, whilst I find it a fascinating area of study, I'll be honest, it's not a career path that I particularly want to go into. And I sometimes wonder how these people really operate with each other, and the stereotypes of politicians stabbing each other in the back. That's how it comes across, and that's not a military standard, and that's not a military way of life, in my opinion.
Okay, so in a way you have kind of told me what you think it tells us about the nature of politics, but thank you very much, George. We're going to take a short break there. If you are enjoying this conversation, please do come and watch the extended version on our Politics Classroom platform, and you can hear more about George's views. And after our short break, we are going to dive a bit deeper into some of them. Thank you, George.